started because we were on an accelerated timeline, I just learned. So I want to start by acknowledging that we're gathered today on the traditional unceded ancestral lands of the Musqueam people. And I'm personally grateful to be able to come to this beautiful place to work, and also grateful for this community that we have and our efforts to work for a more just and sustainable future. I'm delighted to introduce Tatiana, there she is, who will be giving the first presentation today. Tatiana came to us a couple of years ago from Colombia. She came here with a natural science background, but decided to embark on a social science project. And she has really impressed everybody with the rapidity of which she took on these social science methods and her great productivity as well. She's really just done a huge amount of work in a very short time. So I'm really excited to see her talk today. And I also want to say that I'm just very glad as well that she has decided to stay with us beyond the master's. She is going to continue with her PhD. She was awarded a 4-year fellowship from UBC, and she's going to go back to her first love of lizards. So on to Tatiana.
Can you hear me? Okay. So hello, my name is Tatiana. As you already know, I'm from Colombia, and I'm going to present my thesis revealing the pathway to scale up agricultural transformation, factors influencing the adoption of silvopastoral systems in Colombia. I'm very grateful to be in this territory. So this is the agenda for today. You can follow it with aligning the button of each slide. And I want to start with a little background. Colombia is one of the most biodiverse places of the world. It has the 8th most extensive forest coverage of the world too. And it's therefore a very important place for the global ecosystem services. It ranks second in inequality, with rural farmers experience a lot of poverty, which is very sad. Current problem in Colombia is that most of the forest is being transformed into extensive cattle ranching, which is sadly a situation that also occurs in other places of Latin America. Extensive cattle ranching occupies 30% of the national territory, 80% of the agricultural land, and only contributes to 1.6% of the national GDP. And it has a lot of negative environmental impacts, such as biodiversity loss, soil erosion, deforestation. It is inefficient in production with only a few cows for a lot of land. It's unsustainable, and it keeps farmers in social vulnerability. For all these reasons, the Sustainable Cattle Ranching Project was launched by all these institutions, especially the Cattle Ranching Federation of Colombia, CIPAF, and the Nature Conservancy, to transform the grass monocultures into a more diversified system called silvopastoral systems. Silvopastoral systems are an agroecological alternative for cattle production, which is very promising, and which incorporates trees, shrubs, pastures, and enhanced technology to make the landscape more diversified and heterogeneous and increase productivity. These systems are very beneficial for biodiversity conservation, ecosystem services, carbon sequestration, water regulation, crop productivity. In fact, in some farms, milk has doubled after adopting these systems. And therefore, the income of farmers also increases and their vulnerability decreases, both in economic and environmental ways. Although the silvopastoral project in Colombia affected like many regions and more than 4,000 farms, there's still like a lot of room to grow in Latin America. And this was such a big effort from the institutions that I told you, trying to make farmers adopt different types of silvopasture that exist out there. So I have this big question of how can we further scale up these systems in Latin America and Colombia to bring more benefits for nature and people. Therefore, my research goal is to determine the factors that influence adoption of silvopastoral systems to understand how can we scale them up. I did this in two main ways, in Latin America more generally, and then in Colombia with the specific sustainable cattle ranching project that I work with. So the methods are the first chapter of my thesis is a systematic literature review, and the second chapter is a quantitative analysis with the data of adoption of silvopastoral systems. So for the first chapter, we search with Sabine words related to livestock and all the things that you can see in the slide. Then we select the documents, we code it, adopting a conceptual framework, and summarize the results. These are the type of documents that we were looking for and that we managed to find. And this just shows a little of the methods that we use. 5 databases, found 384 registers in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. And after screening and including, we ended up with 58. The results for this is that, as we were expecting and hoping to find, the literature is spread through Latin America with a big representation of Mexico and Colombia, and they are ranging from 2000 to current days. So before I start with this big plot, I want to walk you through the categories that we landed up with after our literature review. These were themes that were consistent and that appeared, and then we would make like small groups. So information transfer relates to all the ways in which farmers can get information. It can be technical assistance, it can be members of an association, or having strong social connections with their neighbors. Management relates to all the decisions that farmers have to do in their lands, but also to the labor or work or activities that they do in their farms. Economic incentives, it's also very important, and it's all the monetary incentives that they can have. One that appear very consistently was payments for ecosystem services. And yeah, market and ecosystem services are a little more broad scale and talk about the bigger economic sphere and the regulation or environmental things that can come with the silvopastoral systems. So this graph shows in the x-axis the number of papers that mention these themes. And in green, we can see when these themes appeared as a positive effect on adoption, in red a negative influence, and gray a no influence. So as you can see in this plot, information transfer and economic incentives are the ones with the larger green bar. So they can be an enabler for adoption, especially technical assistance and payments for ecosystem services. While the ones that have a larger red bar are management and market, which relate to how silvopastoral systems are more complex, require more labor, and just have a learning curve, which makes it harder for farmers. Related to that, it's the market, which is talking mainly about the lack of market for sustainable products. There's not really people paying more money for the extra effort that farmers have to do. And that appears consistently, as well as the production costs for the farmers. I classified these into 3 main themes: the social, the economic, and the environmental. And these were used to guide the second part of my thesis, which is more quantitative. The first part of the second chapter is the socioeconomic analysis, where I use survey data collected by Fedegan in more than 4,000 farms. They had real land use cover change. So we have hectares of silvopasture adopted by each farm. And we have a lot of other variables related to social and economic and management practices of the farmers, and did a mixed effect model to understand the effect of this on adoption. So the results of these are, as expected, information transfer. It's important, as we already said in literature. We could not assess the impact of technical assistance per se, because all the farms that participated in the project received technical assistance. But this one that you're seeing is just additional if they were getting another source of technical assistance. We see a positive influence of distance to the nearest neighbor, which might be talking about communication between farmers. And within the management practice, is very interesting that farmers that are more environmentally friendly, let's say they use more BMPs that are best management practices, such as water protection, forest conservation, and soil, like letting the soil rest, have a positive, adopted more. So this variable has a positive effect. Vegetation diversity also had a positive effect, while farms that are less environmentally friendly and use more input, fertilizer, chemicals, adopted less, which is kind of expected and interesting. Regarding the economic aspects, I just want to highlight this big effect of payments for ecosystem services. Is by far the variable of interest that had the largest effect on adoption. And yeah, and also farm area, it's important, and it has been related to wealth of the farmer. So wealth, capacity of investment, more likelihood of adoption. The second part of the second chapter is the environmental analysis. That as we saw in the literature, environmental factors are also important. And to take into account them, I looked for secondary information on national institutions of Colombia regarding soil, water, weather, and forest coverage. Got a lot of layers, tried to find out which were more clean and usable, and extracted the data, and then did a similar method with a mixed effect model. The results for these, I just don't want you to focus too much in the titles of the x-axis, but what I'm saying. There's a lot of variables related to water. So for instance, if a farm experienced a lot of precipitation anomaly, so too much rain or too much drought, they adopted more. Whereas if they have more hydric demand or hydric vulnerability, they adopted less. What can I tell from this? So there's farms, like the environmental variables are acting as constrainers and enablers. Some farmers might be using them to mitigate the effects of climatic events, but some others might be just constrained because the trees will die as soon as they plant them, and it's not sense for some of them, according to the literature. This one is very interesting because regarding the ecosystem services that literature says, soil recovery appears consistently in like half of the documents that we read. And we find here that farmers that have severe erosion were the ones that adopted more, talking about like how they might be motivated to make their farms better. And similar to the things that I was telling you about the environmental awareness, farmers that already have forests or water springs were more likely to adopt. So what can we get from my thesis, and what would be recommendations to scale up? If we want to scale up silvopastoral systems, we have to focus on economic aspects and economic incentives. Giving trees, seeds, or payment for ecosystem services is very important to overcome the initial financial barrier. But also we have to engage with local markets and support the farmers, because that's the other bigger constraint for farmers to adopt. It's important also to facilitate information transfer, provide technical assistance, promote social networks, support promotion of projects that increase awareness. And also we need more information on silvopastoral systems in general. This is very context specific, so including it in universities will help overcome the knowledge barrier. And if we want to scale up silvopastoral systems, we also have to take into account the environmental context. How are farmers experiencing climatic effects? How are their soils, their water vulnerability? And a way of overcoming this is to use local vegetation, native species, and take it into account the local knowledge from farmers. It's something mentioned in literature. So the future steps is me just like trying to get my thesis done. And I want to thank everyone that has gave me feedback. Thank you so much for your attention. Okay, so the question for the Zoom people is if there's differences in the literature in English, Portuguese, and Spanish, and there definitely is. I think that more quantitative, like hardcore studies were done in English with these models, whereas Spanish and Portuguese had a lot of like qualitative, very nice things. Like I enjoyed a lot reading a thesis because they did like focus groups and interviews where you could like to hear the farmer's perspective of like, I don't adopt because ants will ruin my crops, or I really want to see more biodiversity here. So not to say that English ones didn't have it, but just like the translation of those specific interviews sections will not be possible in English like 100%.
Some of the variables were, I was wondering if some of them might just be the reverse relationship instead of being the cause of adoption. They might be a product of adoption. Thought about that.
That's a great question. And yeah, I definitely thought about that because there's like the effect cause effect. We don't know, like we just have correlations. We cannot say because of farm size, they are adopting more. That would be a different like study method. But yeah, like one specifically that I think about is farm area. We don't know if having a farm area will be more likely. It's the reason why they are more likely to adopt more, or just because, yeah, there's more spare area they can adopt. You know what I mean? Like the both way relationship. Yeah, so the question is if there are specific areas or neighbors that we would address to make changes bigger. Yeah, I think that farmer associations are extremely important, and in all the cases, there's always like a leader in each community. It can be a 5 people community or 100 people community. Those leaders are very important, and one of the qualitative, very nice studies that I read showed how these like 2 farmers of a region that had this innovative personality really encouraged all the other farmers of their like neighborhood and region to adopt more because they are usually curious and open, but also like very good with social dynamics. So they would really want to share whatever they have learned. Okay, so if I could ask those 4,000 farmers another thing, I would like, there's some things that I understand that are more methodological constraints. So something that appeared in literature was a lot of the macro scale factors, right? The market, how policies work, how big things act in the farmer level. So I wouldn't ask the farmers about that, but maybe I would further like to understand how they can actively participate in these adoption processes, because from my perspective, there's a lot of still like colonialism going on, and like the Western science says this, we should do that, and instead of being more collaborative. So I would like, and that's sort of what I want to explore in the PhD, like what are in the social, besides the lizard, what are things that we can learn from farmers, and how can we build a strategy that works for both? Because I feel for them, like it's more complicated. You need other type of equipment to prune the things, to more workers to go around the farms. So what have they learned from adopting them, like the long-term lessons would be very valuable to plan new implementation projects. Okay, thank you.
It's my pleasure to introduce Jumi Gogoi. Jumi grew up in northeastern India in a state called Assam. That's northeast of Bangladesh. Some of you may have had Assam tea. Jumi, before coming to UBC, she did 2 master's degrees in economics and then business analytics in the UK and the USA, and then got thrown into a project looking at climate change and crop production in the Canadian prairies. The most interesting or important thing that's happened is that 3 weeks ago to the day, Jumi defended her PhD. So I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Jumi Gogoi.
I hope you can hear me. Thank you, Naveen, for the introduction. And thank you all for being here. It's very nice to see everyone. So today I'll be presenting findings from one of my chapters in the thesis. Sorry for the noise. Broadly, my thesis looked at crop yield estimation in the Canadian prairies, where we assessed the role of scale satellite in biophysical data. And I'll be presenting findings from one of the chapters, which looks at developing a field scale crop yield prediction model. But before diving into the results, I'd like to start with a little bit of background to our research. So as we all know, the Canadian prairies is an agricultural powerhouse. Agricultural operations are spread over 51 million hectares of farm area, which is about 81% of the total farm area nationwide. And the most common farm type in this region is grain and oilseed farms, which occupy a share of about 49%. And these farms have produced a total of about 70 to 90 million tons of grain and oilseeds in the last couple of years. So all these numbers place Canada as the 5th largest exporter of agricultural products. And given this economic importance of the Canadian agricultural sector, it's important to monitor crop production. And historically, there have been two yield data collection methods, one that uses questionnaires and the other that uses telephonic interviews. And this data is collected 3 times in a year by the collection authority, which is Statistics Canada. And although these methods have existed for a time now, there's still some challenges with these methods, which basically relates to sampling frequency and size, some data reliability issues, and some lack of publicly available spatial data. However, there is a third way to monitor crop production, and that uses the use of satellite imagery. And what you see here is the Sentinel sensor, which is operated by the European Space Agency. And what we get is in every 2 to 3 days, we get a complete viewing of our planet at a high spatial resolution of 10 meters. So using satellite imagery, we are able to view our entire planet as a data set generating process. So what these type of images allow us to do is track spatially the crop growth across the growing season. For example, you could track growth from emergence to maturity and harvesting using some quantitative matrix such as normalized difference vegetation index. And when we distill these maps down to quantitative numbers, what we get is a crop growth curve through the growing season. And this is for a single agricultural region, but because satellite imagery has wide coverage, we're able to get a curve for multiple agricultural regions at the same time. So we get a comprehensive sort of a crop growth phenology curve. And although these images are very useful, crop yield databases are still key. And in Canada, the legacy models that exist is the integrated Canadian crop yield forecaster, which was developed and also currently used by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. And this model was developed using coarse resolution crop yields. As you can see, it's a very coarse resolution data set. And it takes in a legacy coarse resolution satellite input, which is a 1 kilometer data set, and adds it to some climate variables. And in terms of performance, what we see is at a 1 month lead time before harvest, the model has an error range of about 15 to 30% if you follow the color range in the prairies. So basically, we see that there's still room for improvement using a satellite-based approach. So in terms of what's available now, we see that crop yield data sets of finer spatial scales have become available due to opening up of provincial crop yield data archives. For example, we have yield data sets at a municipality scale. And also due to adoption of precision farming approaches, we have yield data sets at field or subfield scale. And on the satellite imagery side, we have a host of private and public data sets. And the most popular private public data set is the Landsat imagery, which goes back to the 1970s. And the youngest sensor in the ecosystem is the Sentinel European sensor, which I just showed you. And it started its operations in 2014. And due to availability of cloud computing platforms such as Google Earth Engine, it's become easy to sort of seamlessly integrate these data sets. So given that these data sets are available now, we're looking at how can we use or leverage these products to sort of improve satellite-based yield estimation in the prairies. So basically using these new crop yield data sets at both scales, but I'll be showing you results for the subfield scale. We could look at integrating some biophysical ancillary inputs with some satellite data. And because we see an increase in data volume and variety, we could also introduce some data-driven methods such as machine and deep learning. And in terms of methods, just like show you a quick run of the methods because these are fairly similar for all of my chapters. So it starts with acquisition of the data, the target and the predictors, different inputs, satellite, weather, and the environmental data sets, all processed on Google Earth Engine. And then the next step of data wrangling, which involves basically calculation of the variables of interest. We are calculating some satellite vegetation indices, some direct weather indicators, and some agroclimatic indices, aggregated to a subfield scale of about 30 meters. And what we get is a final tabular modeling data set at 30 meters. And using this data set, we're moving on to the process of modeling, which basically involves splitting of the data into 80-20 training testing scenario, followed by a 10-fold cross-validation and hyperparameter tuning to get the best model fit with the machine and deep learning methods. And what we get when we do an accuracy assessment is the best performing model, which is used for the final application of estimating or forecasting yields. So finally, moving on to my third chapter, which is basically developing a field level crop yield prediction model using satellite and environmental data. So this is only possible because of precision farming, which amplifies data volume. So in terms of data volume, we can see that using a combine harvester, which is used by farmers at a field scale, at a point resolution, which is at a latitude longitude resolution for just one field, one crop type in one year, we have greater than 13,000 observations for one crop type. And even when we aggregate it to a 30-meter resolution to match the Landsat resolution, we have more than 1,000 observations in just a single year. So we see a huge increase in data volume when we're going from like a coarse municipality scale to a subfield scale. So basically leveraging these data sets now with deep learning, what we have is our target is basically crop yields from one farm in southern Alberta. And it covers the time period 2007 to 12 for all three crops of interest. And this basically gives us a yield observation data set of about 100,000 observations. And on the target, we have some Landsat vegetation indices and some day-made weather variables. And we also had some elevation data, which was given to us by the farmer. And because we go from such a like a sparse data set to a data set that has a lot of volume and variety, we're introducing some deep learning methods, basically deep neural networks. We have two deep learning methods, the deep neural network and the convolutional neural network. We have two machine learning models, the random forest and the extreme gradient boosting model. And finally, the benchmark, which is the multiple linear regression model. And basically, we are running all these models on different combinations of input data sets, like the benchmark satellite data product and the integrated input data sets. So what we found was that combining diverse inputs improved estimation quality of the models. That is, for example, with a random forest barley model, when we went from a single feature type space that is just satellite inputs to an integrated feature space combining weather, we saw an improvement of about 1%. And when we increase the number of feature types, that is, we introduce elevation to the weather and index data set, we saw another improvement of 1%. So a total improvement of 2% going from just a satellite data to an integrated input set. And using this optimal input data set, we saw that in terms of performance, the machine and deep learning methods were performing an improvement of about 5 to 7% compared to the baseline linear regression model. So we saw a good improvement of about 5 to 7% across crop types. And overall, we found that a machine learning model, that is the random forest model, recorded the best performance for each crop type, as you can see on the distributions. It was able to capture the peaks and the tails. However, it was sort of overestimating the peaks and sort of underestimating the tails of the distribution. And in terms of historical performance of the model, it was able to sort of capture the patterns in the field. So this is the observed and the estimated by the model. We can see that the model is able to mimic the spatial patterns as observed in the observational data set. And in terms of the overall performance, we found that for each crop type, the median prediction error was about 6%. And like with the difference of about 25% of the fields having a error of less than 6%, the remaining 65 had an error range of 6 to 9%, and the remaining of the fields had an error between 9 to 11%. And although these models perform very well with historical data sets, the real potential of these models is in the forecasting mode, that is in-season forecasting. So what we did next was basically run this optimal model in an in-season forecasting mode. And what we saw is that the performance stabilizes 3 months before harvest, and the median harvest date indicated by the vertical line in the plot. So we see that for canola and wheat, the model performance stabilizes 3 months prior to harvest. And when we looked at the aggregate farm scale, we also saw some temporally varying performance. In some years, it was able to sort of capture the observed pattern, but in some years it was off. And the years where we don't have any output is the years basically where we did not have any input data for model training. But for the barley model, we found that the model performance only stabilized 15 days prior to harvest. So there is still room for improvement with the barley model, as you can see below. So basically some key takeaways at the field scale, what we found was that an increase in data input variety improved estimation quality. That was, we went from a higher error to a lower error when we moved from a benchmark satellite data set to an integrated input data set. Also using this optimal data set, we found that nonlinear models were able to perform better. We saw lower error. And we also found that this optimal combination of integrated inputs and a machine or a deep learning method has a forecasting potential, but also a denser and a longer time series would further help to sort of refine the performance of these models. So lastly, thank you. Like our funding body was Alberta Innovates. I'd also like to thank the prairie farmer who gave us this data sets for the work. And basically my lab who has been with us, who has been helping us through all these years. So thank you all. Sure. So the question is if these models are applicable in different agricultural regions and in policy context. So definitely, I think these models can be applied in different agricultural regions, but the model specifications would have to be changed because as you change regions, the crop yield distributions would change depending upon the management inputs, the different kind of practices that go on into practice, like getting the harvest. So a bit of tweaking in the feature space, and only in those specific areas where the agroecological conditions were sort of similar when we train these models. So similar crop types and similar sort of agroecological conditions would be the ideal scenario when these models can be sort of exported. And in terms of policy, yeah, like at the municipality scale, I think these models can help in like building, like they have forecasting potential. So like 3 months before harvest, they have a good idea like what the amount is going to be. So they have like it has like good implications for like import as well, depending on the situation. So very helpful when they run basically in the forecasting mode. Yeah, so the question was what sort of changes would we anticipate if the farmer knew beforehand, if the question is right. So basically for canola and wheat, we saw that the model performance stabilizes 3 months before harvest. It has like implications for farm economics. So for the farmer could plan for grain storage, like how much he's committed for delivery. So he has a real idea on in terms of his farm economics. But I think it's too late in the season to make any management decisions because it's already been seeded, and I think fertilization and irrigation input decisions have already been sort of embedded when the plant was sort of seeded. So more on the farm economic side and then on the management side. But I think if we are able to sort of stabilize the model performance early in the season, I think then it might have some management implications and uses as well. Right, Claire? Right. Right. So the question, if I understood correctly, if we are picking up the variation signals in our input data set, so I think so because we have like a ton of, so maybe I'll just pull up a slide. So we're not just using one index, but so we have like a host of indices that are capturing different traits. So we have biomass, water, and chlorophyll. So they're basically capturing different variations in the crop growth aspect, and these are fed into the model. So it's sort of capturing the different aspects that's influencing the end of season yield estimate essentially. So all of this goes into the model in addition to the weather data set that tracks basically the weather component of the growing season. Right. I mean, exactly, because these values are at 30 meters. So we have, maybe I'll pull up. So so for example, the water index map, so it has variation within the field. So that is picked up in the satellite signal that goes into the model. Yes, Dan. So in the farm, so the question is like which variables were influential in driving the performance of the models. So at the field scale, the weather-based variables were ranked higher. So I think solar radiation, the precipitation, accumulated precipitation over the growing season, and then we also had an aridity index. So all three of them were prominent across 3 crop types. But it was different at the municipality scale. So at the municipality scale, we found that satellite data had a bigger signal, the water index, this particular index, NTWI. But at the field scale, it was the opposite. We found that the weather-based indicators had a higher influence in driving model performance. So even though we did not have a lot of spatial variation with the weather data, we had temporal variation because we're covering about 6 years of study period. So that temporal information was sort of influential in driving performance quality of these models in the estimation and forecasting mode. Yes, hi one. So the question is like potential barriers to adoption of the developed methods. Absolutely, I think the barriers firstly with regards to like availability of data to develop the model at the prairie scale right now is just for one farm in the prairies. So we have a very limited data like applicability or model applicability in this case. So basically, like this is proprietary data, like a lot of like data sharing issues come into play. So depending upon how much data becomes available publicly, so I think at the field scale, it's perhaps like a lot of barriers to adoption across the prairies. But I think at the municipality scale, because that data set is publicly available, I think that model has potential. Like for example, this model, right? So we can see that 61% of the municipalities had errors less than 10%, which is an improvement over the legacy models, which had a range of 15 to 30%. So these models can be easily adopted, I think, because they're using all public data sets. Sure. Thank you. So the question is, if we can transfer the already developed models, like developed using US yield data sets in the Canadian context. Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, we didn't think of that. I think we could give that a try, at least at the municipality scale, because we have these observed like at a consistent level, right? So we have these data sets across the prairies for a couple of good years. So I think that could be a good test, I think, because even US data sets are always at a county scale and the models are developed at a county scale. I think that could be a good sort of test to see if like they perform better than the legacy models, like what's already used right now. Thank you for the question. Yeah. Right. So the question is how I split the data to minimize data leakage. So it was a random split in our case at an 80-20 split, random, but we also tried splitting on space and time. That is, in the case of municipalities, the municipality, and in the case of fields, like using fields as the space parameter, and in time, basically using a year. But we found that whatever cross-validation or splitting approach we used, like the model performance did not change a lot. So so we went with a random split, but in the random split, the yield distributions were similar, but in a space and a time split, the yield distributions were completely different, but it did not influence model performance by that much. So the question is my research plans for my postdoc position. So we're trying to expand this to other agricultural regions in Canada. For example, Ontario has some new yield data sets that have become available. We're also trying to export this methodology to the global south. For example, India, like models have not been updated in the last couple of years. The legacy models again like use Morris data. So we could sort of update the data sets and see how model performance improves. And there is also no crop yield forecasting model in India. So perhaps something that exists in Canada, perhaps we could, like also develop that for a country like India, which like it could have huge benefits there. So thank you. Thank you.